Hi, everybody. My name is Al Spiegel, and I'm the Laptop Program Coordinator at Bergen Catholic High School. Today, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about data, test data. What do we do with all this great data that our students give us once they've taken an exam soft test? So I want to look at a couple different things and a couple different questions about, things for you to think about in terms of what do we do with test results. Bergen Catholic is where I am. We're a school of about 725 boys and 60 teachers. We are in the New Jersey, New York metro area, and we draw kids from about 90 different towns. We're about 20 minutes from the George Washington Bridge and minutes from New York City. We average around 23 students per class. Our tuition is approximately $16,000 a year. This is the third year. We're going into our third year in September of our 2-to-1 initiative with MacBooks and iPads. We've been a 1-to-1 school since 2002 with Lenovo's, but we transitioned 2 years ago to start using MacBooks and iPads. So our current freshmen, sophomores, and transfer students have a MacBook Air 11-inch and an iPad mini 32 gig. Both devices are covered for Apple Care under 3 years. Our current juniors and seniors still have Lenovo's, but as I said, we're going to phase them out. So by September of 2017, we will all be on one platform using MacBooks and iPads. So the first of the two questions that I want to ask really is, and you really need to think about this before you answer it. You have to think about it. Is why do we test? Why do you give a test? Are you trying to assess? Are you trying to measure student learning? Are you trying to increase retention of the content? Are you trying to figure out what your students know? Are you trying to stump them? Are you trying to boost their confidence? What is your motive for giving a test? Is that the only assessment you know how to do? Are you required to? Are you told that you have to give a certain amount of tests per term? Right? And that doesn't matter if you're in K-12 or higher ed. What is the rationale that you use when you test? Okay? Because I think part of that's important, because one of the best things I learned in graduate school was that figures never lie, but liars figure. So if your tests give you the results as they are, what do they mean? But before you get to that part, you have to figure out, why do we test in the first place? If I'm testing because I really want to stump the students and I don't want them to do well, then your numbers are going to reflect that. Whereas if you're testing, if you're going to assess, or you're going to, you want to try and really figure out what they know, then you might come out with a different outcome. So that's the first part. Some questions to ask yourself, as I was alluding to, did I make this question too difficult? When you do each question, if you're preparing an objective test and you're putting questions on there, did I make this question too difficult? Am I trying to enhance student thinking, trying to make them think a little bit? Am I trying to punish? Am I trying to stump them, and make them purposely difficult so that they don't get them correctly? I can't answer that. As an individual teacher, you have to think about that. Am I also, on the flip side, am I trying to make the question too easy? Am I trying to boost confidence? Am I trying to give them maybe a grade boost? They have been doing well as a whole, and maybe some easy questions might help bring up their grades, kind of thing. But as you look at the results and you see, wow, and I'm going to show you this in a minute, wow, all the kids got this question correctly, or answered it correctly. That's great. Does that mean that I taught the material, or does it mean the question was too easy? What does that mean? Or on the hindsight, if they all got the question wrong, does that mean that none of them know what's going on? Or did I ask the question, did I word it incorrectly, anything like that? So it's really important, I think, for each question you put on that test, you have to ask yourself, am I making the question difficult? Am I making it too easy? What's my purpose for asking this question? Does it relate back to a content standard? Does it relate back to a course objective? What's the reason that I have for asking this particular question? The next question you have to ask is, what do I do with the results? What do I do with my results now that I have results in hand? My students have taken an exam soft test. I've pulled in that data. What do I do with it? Do I adjust? Do I leave it alone? Do I see that, wow, none of the students got this question right, I'm going to give them credit for that question? Am I going to throw away the test? The test was bad, I don't think it was good, let's just throw it away and do it again. Do we leave the scores alone? Do we retest? Do we take the average of the first test, the second test, and put them together? What do I do with the results? because I have good data now. My students have taken the test, and if I'm confident with the fact that the test was designed good, then what do I do with those results? What do I do with kids that didn't do well? Ones that did great. Did one or two kids get 100 and everybody else failed? What do I look for? And that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about, and some best practices that we try here, and what I encourage my teachers to do in terms of looking at their assessments after the fact to see, what that data is telling them. So one of the first things that I like to look at are the item analysis for each question. I think that that's a real good place to start, and it's a practice for a number of years. So this is a question that was from a summer reading test. It was a freshman course, and the book was a double helix. So this was a question that's a basic Bloom's lower level type of question, basic recall. And you can see that 86% of the students got the question correct. And even across the board, the 107 kids that answered the question across the board, 95 of them got it right. So it was a good question. I look at this as they knew the material, because it wasn't intended to be a difficult question. The distractors were, minimally distracting at best, but for the most part, these students knew, that C was the correct answer. It didn't take them long to come to that conclusion, about 22 seconds, and I think to me, that's a good question. But what is interesting to me, the next question, like 2 questions down on that same test, and this is actual data that we use. This isn't made up. Here's another question, same idea, same lower level type question. But if you look at the spread, only 46% of the students got the question correct, and they were distracted by all the distractors. B more so than C and D, but still there was a distraction. And if you look at the performance history, it's roughly about the same. That students across the board were confused by this. So now the first thing I say as a teacher is, why is that? Why were these students who answered this lower level type question so thrown off by the distractors in the question? Now, this is where I think as a teacher, I need to go and say to the students, what were you thinking? And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean, what was going through your head when you read this question? Were you confused by the names? Were you confused by, could you not remember what the right person was? What was going through your head? And I think that feedback loop is really important for students to be able to provide their teachers with, some feedback as to what they were thinking and why they answered the way they did. The thing that I like about ExamSoft is that, if all my students take the test, we can look at those results as soon as they're done. Let's go and see, okay, what were you thinking? Not a week later when we finally get around to grading the test. It's, what were you thinking? What were you thinking right now when you took that test? And in this case, it's definitely, I wouldn't want to say to them, was the question worded poorly? Was there something that confused you? I think it's important to ask students for feedback, because if they made the mistake, chances are next term students are going to make the same mistake. So I want to nail that, before I have any other problems, because if the question is bad, then I potentially might want to, not use the question again. I'm not sure. I know I'm not a fan of throwing away the points, but I don't want to use the question again if I know it's bad. But what I'm equally as concerned about is that this was a problem across the board with this question. In 4 different sections of biology, they all got they answered the question about the same. So I need to come to grips with why that's the case. Now, when I first started teaching 17 years ago, I wouldn't have asked students, for your feedback. But I think as I've grown as an educator, I think that that's critical to have that conversation and say, hey, what happened? Why did you not answer this question correctly? The next thing I like to look at is the time spent per question. Now, this is a graph that I threw these numbers into Excel. What I do for this is I'll look at the assessment and I'll record the average per question, the average time per question, and then I'll group them into groups of 10-second intervals. So in this case, there were 23 questions that were answered between 11 and 20 seconds. And when I look at this graph, it speaks a lot to me. It looks like, for the most part, I'm designing an hour and 45-minute midterm exam, which this is from, and most of the students were answering each question within, I'd say, an appropriate time frame. Maybe some of them were going through a little too quickly, but this was a freshman year course. I'm not, concerned that the numbers are where they are. There were some that that took a while to answer, which is okay. Maybe I knew that ahead of time, but I like this look for me. I with a Scantron test or a paper test, I could never figure out if I wrote an hour and 45-minute test, were students using the hour and 45, were they using an hour and 30 minutes, were they going over, were they don't have enough time, do they have too much time and they're finished in 32 minutes. So this gives me a real nice graphic of how many questions are they answering in this in this time frame, and I think this is appropriate. Would I like to see it a little more in the middle? Perhaps, but depending on the subject area, depending on the class, and all that, I think this is okay. It didn't take me long to put these numbers into Excel. I have a template that I use, and I suggest that teachers do this. I don't do this for every quiz or every test, but maybe like a unit test, definitely for our midterm exams. When I give a midterm, for an AP course, that's my potentially first chance to see how these students are going to respond to a 3-hour test. And I will break down, every question, and I'll look at stuff like this, because this can help me down the line when they take that AP exam in May. I could say, hey, listen, on the midterm, you were struggling to get through 40 questions. Now I've got some real-time data in hand. I can say, hey, we need to speed it up. We can't be spending more than this number of seconds on a question, because you've got to get through 40 questions in an AP case in an hour and a half. So you need to be on top of that. And I think having this data really pushes the students to, okay, this is where you need to be in terms of how long you're taking to answer a specific question. The start and the end times, I like looking at for a variety of reasons. Number one, as I said before, I could see if my test if students are using the test time fully, and I like the fact that it separates active time and total time, because if you look at these numbers, which are, again, these are real numbers, they're right on the money. And a student here took an hour and 10 minutes and an hour and 15, but most of them were in between an hour and 20-something minutes to the actual hour and 45. Okay? But none of them were idle for a long amount of time. They were all engaged in the test. There's one that's off by a minute, two that are off by a minute, 3, but otherwise they were engaged in the test. This is also helpful, at least from a K-12, but also I think as a higher ed professor, I write a test that's an hour and 45 minutes. Students take 25 minutes, and then they're complaining that they didn't have enough time to finish it. Well, I can look and say you sat there and you didn't do anything from this time to that time, and that's very helpful. It's helpful in a K-12 when parents tell me that my son just didn't he didn't have enough time to finish the test, but he sat there for over an hour and did nothing. And then there's no real comeback to that. It's because the data is right here, and the numbers aren't lying. That here's how long you took for the test, and here's how long you were actively doing something, whether you were navigating or typing or whatever, in the test. So I like this look. I like that. I might take this out and dump it into Excel. I look at if I teach multiple sections, I'll look at it as a whole. We're big on horizontal and vertical line with our curriculum. So I might look at, horizontally, if I'm teaching, Algebra 1, did every section of Algebra 1, even though there's 3 teachers, did everybody perform around the same, on the same assessment? This gives us, some new types of data that we couldn't do with paper. And now we can look at, do we really write a true test, that you had an hour and 45 for, and students took an hour and 15 for, and we can say that 90% of the students who took the test, that's where they fell in. So this is really this is also a really good help for us. Then we look at completion time as a whole, and I like to look at this in chunks of students. So looking at this graph, it's also an Excel graph. In the middle, there were 8 students that took between 80 and 89 minutes to complete the test. Would I expect something like this? Yeah, this was an AP class, a smaller AP class. I would expect the numbers that I see. It did take some students longer. The troubling thing, there's a student that took less than 70 minutes to take the test. If I was designing it for an hour and 15, that student took, didn't take enough time. The 70 to 79 is right on the cusp, but there were 12 students that took almost the full amount of time, and that in this case is roughly half the class. So that's something to look at too. They might be the outliers. That's another thing for conversation with these students. When I would give that AP midterm exam, the first 2 days of the following quarter were, let's talk about the test and what did you do. Let's look at the questions and let's look at what you did wrong, what you did right. And part of it is too, well, why did you take so much time here? And especially trying to get students into a timed test-taking mode where you've only got X number of minutes to take a part of the AP exam. I can look at this completion time and say you're on target or you're not even close. The first time I'll give an AP practice test. Let's just see how long it takes them. Let's not time them and see what happens. And I might say, okay, it's an hour and a half right now. And where are you? And we can mark that they're not done or they've got X number of questions left. But looking at this graphic, I think, is important, because if I find that a lot of my students are on the right-hand side of this graph, then I might need to look at my test and see if it's it's too long, it's some of the questions are difficult, anything in that regard. The snapshot, what I use the snapshot for is, again, I could never do this with paper. How many times did a student change their mind? We always encourage students, do not change an answer on a multiple choice test unless you're absolutely sure that you're going from the wrong answer to the right answer. But how many times, we can now look at, oh, I had the right answer and I went to a wrong answer, or I had the wrong answer and successfully, went to the right answer. The way I do this, I will take the snapshot viewer, and again, not for every quiz or, but like for a big test, I'll take every student snapshot, dump it into Excel, and I'll use the subtotal function to look for, I'll separate it by question to see if there was any change. Now, this student on question 17 changed his answer in a matter of 3 seconds. What does that mean? Did every student do that? And incidentally, this goes back to exam security. I could also look at this and say, wow, there's a lot of students changing answers. Was there anything going on during the administration of the test? But I could then follow up with this student and say, hey, listen, on 20 questions, you changed your answer from from the wrong answer to the right answer, or the right to the wrong answer. Why was that? What were you thinking when you did that? Were you unsure? And maybe for each question they got wrong, they chose the primary distractor. So they were within a right answer. They were, they successfully eliminated 2 distractors or 3 distractors, and they were stuck with, the primary distractor and then the right answer. So this is good. Again, it opens up conversation for me as an instructor to have with students that I ordinarily couldn't be able to have. I would look at a Scantron or look at a test and say, oh yeah, you erased here, but I don't know why you did that, as opposed to here where I can say you definitely, you had the right answer and you changed it, or you had the wrong answer and then you realized it was wrong and went to the right answer. The results that we generate, from our tests depends on, my colleagues and I'm not sure we all see eye to eye on this. I believe that you take a test, you get the whole test back. If you have enough questions in a bank, you can recycle them so that, you're not using the same ones every year. But you can release that, and I think students, can learn from this. I can learn and see, wow, I got questions 4 and 5 wrong. Why did I get them wrong? What was the right answer? And what could I do next time to improve on that? Whereas if I don't release any of it, then I'm never going to know. I find that frustrating when if I take a test and I don't know what I did wrong, how do I not make that same mistake again? So this to me is helpful. It's helpful when it's released, sooner rather than later. If it's released in real time, or as close to real time as possible, so students can learn from that. That's part of the learning process, is taking the test and then learning from your mistakes that you made on the test. In this case, I might look and say, wow, I was really off the mark in terms of my average versus the class average, and why is that? So again, this to me is part of that process. It's let's look at what we did wrong, and allocating instructional time to reviewing assessments to make sure that students understand the material they got wrong. I might not go over question 1 if every student got it right, but if I notice that my litmus test is generally right around if half the students got the question wrong, I might go over it. Or if it's one that I thought should have been easy and a lot got it wrong, then I might go over it. But at least I can target those results as opposed to just going over every question and not knowing how many got it right or how many got it wrong. I encourage my teachers to categorize questions. My midterm and final exam questions, for example, I only use them for midterm and final exams. So I can come up with a working bank that I use from year to year to see if I can measure student improvement. Whereas my other tests, I don't. So I specifically have a category for final exam and the year that I tag it as this is the final exam question. So I know I'm not going to use this question on anything else. I want to use it on the final exam because it's measuring something specific, or I like the way it's worded, or I want to try and establish some baseline data from year to year to see, okay, if by the midterm exam, students should be able to answer these questions correctly, and if they don't, what is that speaking to me in terms of what content I'm covering and whatnot? So it's a real easy thing to do, and I encourage my teachers, hey, flag every question this year that you're using on a final exam as for a final exam. So if you want to save it for next year, you don't put it in the test bank somewhere in November and then realize, oh, I want to use that question on the final exam. And then finally, what I was talking about before with feedback, I think is really important. It takes a certain type of teacher, and it also takes a classroom culture that encourages feedback from students. If I have a lot of students that got a question wrong, as I said before, why did you answer this wrong? What were you thinking when you answered this question? And I want to know that because from a potential, I have to read you, my test questions, or did I not cover content, or was it just they just didn't know, like, oh yeah, you did, I remember you talking about this, but I didn't know, I didn't remember, or the example that I have here with lung sounds, in order to figure out what a lung sound is, if you want to figure out that, you could ask a question that oh, if you hear crackling, that's rails. But this question is also tied to I have it tied to an MP3 file, so you actually listen to the lung sound. So you're going to hear that it's, I think I had to set up that it was rails, and then your primary treatment option was albuterol. The other thing you could, you have to know is that what all of these medicines do. So it's a little bit higher order thinking. So, and I put for the feedback, I had a hard time because everything started with an A. It was a good question. I remember learning about albuterol. I remember learning about lung sounds, but everything looks similar. Now, was I trying to do that to be purposely, was I trying to be tricky? Was I trying to make students think? Should I have potentially given medicines that all related to, treatment of respiratory distress? So that's where the feedback is, and there are times as a teacher where wow, I never thought that should be, I never looked at it that way. And it's funny when, students will say to me, well, the answer could be this. And then you really, I didn't think about it like that. But if I'm not strong enough as an educator to ask that question of the students, then I'm not going to get that feedback. And I'm going to give the same question next year, and I'm going to get the same results because I'm not, I didn't know that there was something wrong or the students were viewing it differently. So I think it's real important. It's a culture setter to let students know that it's okay. It's okay to tell me things like this, and it's not going to mean you're going to get a bad grade or you're going to have to sit in the corner or anything like that. It means that I'm genuinely interested in the assessment process, and I'm injecting myself at all parts of that process to make sure that I'm asking the right questions, I'm asking them in an appropriate manner and in a manner that my students understand. So it's a real cultural thing that it takes time, but I think it's definitely worthwhile for teachers to do. So that is the end of my the presentation today. I'm hopefully that you've picked up some ideas in terms of how to use the data that you have in hand, especially in terms of looking at the time students take on questions, looking at each question by itself in terms of how the students answered the questions, and then that feedback loop, which is really important as well.